So just to follow on with the mineral dependency, and Mr. Moores, I really appreciate your testimony, your focus on that. Mr. Zindler, how you have knitted that in with the focus on the renewables and our efforts to reduce emissions. I recognize that part of our challenge is not just the fact that we're not accessing the resource here, but nowhere within this supply chain are we really engaged. And somebody used the terminology, we're absent here. And what did you say, Mr. Moores? Because it was actually, I actually wrote it down. Those that hold the supply chain will control the balance of power, but we're basically a U.S. bystander. Kind of reminds me of the view that I think some in this country and this administration have of the Arctic. We're just kind of, the U.S. is just kind of a bystander here. And we can't afford to be a bystander when we're looking really at the future here. So much of this goes back to investment, because if people are not interested in investing, you can have great ideas, you can have great resources, but we don't get anywhere. So I guess this is a question to both you, Mr. Moores, and Mr. Zindler, whether it is investment in our mineral opportunities and the multiple stages within that supply chain, or whether it's the investment in the new energy technologies. Mr. Zindler, you mentioned that worldwide investment in these new energy technologies is around $332 billion. I'm curious what the breakdown is of the global number in terms of what comes from the U.S. compared to other countries. Are we keeping up with the investment level like we see from China? So let's just talk about investments for a second here.
So just on those numbers, about a third of the investment typically in a given year in clean energy technology or new energy technologies is usually into China.
Is going to China.
Into China. And about $65 billion last year was the U.S. So there's a gap, and there has been pretty consistently over the last 3 or 4 years in particular, with China leading just on pure dollars deployed. To be clear, a lot of that money comes out of China and goes into China. So
right.
China Development Bank, state-owned enterprises, various domestic companies are plowing money into their own operations there.
How about investment on the mineral side, Mr. Moores?
Yeah, it's a balance of investment and incentive to source raw materials from the U.S. Okay, right now the raw materials for batteries aren't available from the U.S., so then you have to build the resource base because it is present. But investment globally in battery raw materials is happening. It's just at present the better opportunities, the tier one opportunities from a resource perspective are not in the U.S. And that's primarily, some of it's down to geology, some of it's down to the fact there hasn't been much of a mining industry in the U.S. for a long, long time. And so at present, the U.S. is almost at the back of the queue for the battery supply chain. A good example of how this can work is the Tesla Gigafactory. So that's a lithium-ion battery plant that Tesla have built with Panasonic in Nevada. And that's a good example of investment. Tesla put up some money, Panasonic put up some money, there was state-level incentives, and that battery plant can't make enough lithium-ion batteries for the vehicles that it sells. And so that's it should be a case study for the EV supply chain within the US, and you should be replicating that time and time again in different states, and then also encouraging the supply chain from the battery up to the mine to actually build out and build every step and drag in knowledge from the chemicals industry, from the mining industry. And a key part of that is the discussion, a key part is hearings like this that need to continue, and we're just at the start. The problem is China and Japan and Korea, we spend a lot of time there at Benchmark, and it's happening at an incredible pace the last 2 years, and it will just continue. We'll just get more intense.
Mm-hmm. It's just such a reminder to me. We have some pretty good source material in Alaska for rare earth elements. but our reality is that we're not processing anything in this country. So if we were able to extract it, where do we send it? To China, only to get it back here. So we're looking at a pretty significant pilot in the sense of being able to do something very different, but it's pretty small. But again, it's just a reminder that it's more than just having the resource itself. It's the access, it's the investment that can allow it to happen, but it's also the process. It's the workers that are trained. It is, as you point out, whole supply chain. My last question, and I prompt myself when I talk about the Arctic and the U.S. role, which in my view is still absolutely lacking, but where we have seen stepped up interest in the Arctic and pursuing opportunities is with our neighbor, Russia, who has more than doubled its LNG exports, and by mid of this year, I'm told, they're scheduled to produce 26 million tons of LNG per year. This is going to be 10% of worldwide LNG exports. 2/3 of this oil and gas is in the EEZ, in the Arctic there, up in the Yamal region primarily. So I guess this is to you, Mr. Book, or Dr. Capuano, just speaking to the Russian investment in the Arctic that we're seeing, the impact sanctions are having or perhaps not having on that development, what it means for the world energy markets. We've hit a little bit on Venezuela and Iran, but obviously Russia is out there as well. So, and then more broad, what do you see as the global Arctic energy future?
Well, Madam Chairman, to the first question, the Russian supply, you can be of two minds about it. And I think in the formation of our sanctions, we were. On the one hand, we want to punish Russia for malfeasance in Ukraine. On the other hand, we don't want to leave global supplies short. And so there was a structure of the sanctions to sort of leave the existing production alone and go after the future, the frontier production, the Arctic deep water and shale resources and technologies and investment from U.S. companies. And what it's shown is that the vastness of their resource was such that with the things that they already had, they could continue moving. The Yamal projects were years in the making and preceded the implementation of sanctions. I think that when you look at into the difficulty in sanctioning a country with such a vast resource base, such a willful disregard for our economic statecraft, and to be fair, it was such a large market that depends on them. There's a lot of challenges in trying to structure something more punitive without having a deleterious price effect for the world. There's more power in some of the sanctions that are directed against Iran because the third-party nexus is in our reach. The Treasury can get into banks that transact in U.S. dollars on behalf of Iranian counterparties, and that has helped to sort of augment the effectiveness. In terms of the Arctic, though, I mean, I think it would be a mistake to overlook a fifth of the world's petroleum resource, the vastness of the opportunity. A lot of the challenge, I think, is always in investment, finding the fastest return with the highest degree, the highest probability of success. And so a lot of the changes that you have pioneered and the steps that have been taken are opening up new options. And I think that we'll really start to see when investor interest shows that there's going to be dollars put into some of the new developments that have been opened up in the Arctic, where things can go. The vastness of the resource is not to be questioned, and I think it would be a mistake to not look for more oil because we're going to need it.
Dr. Capuano, anything to add?
We look forward to modeling it.
Senator Cortez Masto, any final comments? I want to thank you all. Very informative, very helpful to start off our new year here on the committee. I think, Dr. Capuano, you have used the appropriate term. This is a transformational time for us in this country. There is so much going on. It's exciting. It it is fluid and perhaps sometimes difficult to predict because so much is happening as rapidly as it is. What we want to try to do here in the Congress, in the legislative body, is make sure that our policies are as up-to-date and current as what is happening with the technologies. And my assessment on that is we are way behind the innovators out there in terms of policies that keep up, that keep pace with our modern day realities. So thank you for your guidance as we try to shape our policies going forward, and thank you for your expertise and the time that you've given the committee this morning. And with that, we stand adjourned.